Hi everyone. We're gonna get started now as the audience kind of slowly files in. My name is Tariq, and I'm Al-Shabaka's U.S. Policy Fellow, and I'm also the host of our Policy Lab series. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to our latest episode. We're now over a year and counting into the genocide in Gaza, and while the mass slaughter of Palestinians is very much being normalized, political developments both within Palestine and across the region are really continuously changing the trajectory of so many things we've come to take for granted. So as we approach 2025, another major development is coming, and that's Trump's return to the White House. So this comes after we all really spent the last several months leading up to Election Day watching Democrats and Republicans wrestle for the title of Israel's best friend. And that was quite a morbid spectacle that involved candidates basically endlessly trying to one-up each other on who could promise the most unconditional support for Israel and demonize Palestinians the most. And at the end of the day, it's both parties did a really great job of reminding us that life is not going to get better for Palestinians, regardless of who won the election. So while little is certain now about Trump's notoriously unpredictable leadership style, it's pretty clear that his administration is going to do everything they can, like last time, to make Washington's relationship with Israel closer than ever. And in today's Policy Lab, I'm going to be joined by Halah, Ahmad, and Andrew Kadi to discuss what the incoming Trump administration means for Palestinians, how it's going to affect pro-Palestine solidarity in the US, and what we can all do to prepare for it. Halah is a policy analyst with Al-Shabaka, as well as a researcher, writer, and policy communications expert. Most recently, she led legislative affairs as VP for Policy at the Jane Family Institute. Halah also served as U.S. Policy Fellow for Al-Shabaka and has conducted strategic policy research for government agencies and NGOs in Greece, Albania, Germany, Palestine, and the U.S. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Vox, the LA Times, and many other outlets. Andrew is also a policy analyst with Al-Shabaka and a member of the steering committee for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, USCPR. He is also an occasional contributor to The Guardian's Comment is Free, The Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, Left Turn, and other publications. So we have a lot to talk about, and before we get into it, just a quick reminder for the audience about our format. I'll be posing questions for the first 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to save 10 to 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A, depending on if you have questions to ask. Please feel free to submit any questions you have by clicking the Ask Question button on the bottom. It should be on the bottom of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions that you find particularly important to prioritize. And we'll do our best to get to as many as we can with the time that we have. So let's get started. Halah, I want to start with you, and I don't want to get too caught up in relitigating the past couple months, since we've all been really wrapped up in them. But I do feel like it's really important that we first touch on what happened in November, when all is said and done. How much did the genocide in Gaza influence the election process, and more importantly, where does the Palestinian solidarity movement find itself now in the lead up to a second Trump administration?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tariq, and I'm excited to hear also how Andrew weighs in on all of this. But I think it's first of all very important to understand that this election was unprecedented for many things, and one of them was the way in which Palestine was centered in the election discourse, and in strategic conversations as well, on both sides of the aisle about how the election would play among voters during an ongoing genocide. And it was unprecedented as well for the amount of spending in this election. This was the most expensive American presidential election on record. And on the both sides of the aisle, many millionaires and billionaires were part of the campaign contributions, but on the Trump side of things, over 90% of the campaign contributions came from the top 1%. And overall, we saw a combination of factors demonstrate that this was an election that was going to be entangled in issues of democratic rot and a disengaged and disenfranchised, feeling from many voters and actually across the system, where you know, voters felt very unrepresented by the two-party system. But as for Palestine, you know, the role that it played started well in advance of the election. And I think without getting too deep into it, it's important to really take stock of what happened. And in the primary elections, usually voters in the United States would get to cast the ballot for which candidate they want to represent a given political party. And a large portion of voters, in this case, cast votes of no confidence within the Democratic Party's primary for uncommitted or uninstructed. And, you know, the Biden administration and Democratic strategists and folks across the aisle viewed that as a clear sign that something needed to be shaken up before November for there to be a secure victory. And this was true in particular for states that have small margins of victory to begin with. So in many of the key swing states, states that go either to Republican or Democratic Party, you know, and sort of flip-flop each election, the margins were between 0.5 and 1.5% and were expected to be the same, and ended up that way as well, particularly in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. And in those states, there was huge votes of no confidence, uninstructed or uncommitted votes in those states, which were particularly related to the ongoing genocide. Fast forward to November, we had a new candidate. There's no doubt that the uninstructed and uncommitted votes were part of this, played a role in pushing Biden out and forcing a reckoning for the Democratic Party about how they could viably win the election. But there were also calls now to move from a sort of verbal nod from the word ceasefire to a demand for an arms embargo. So you saw collective escalation in our demands to substantiate what it meant to stop the genocide in Gaza. And also, we saw at the same time the beginnings of the first ever joint resolution of disapproval from the Senate to stop pre-approved weapons sales to the Israeli regime on account of the, you know, just continuing record and building record of war crimes. So right before November, we saw that polling was showing that if Harris in particular shifted on the issue of an arms embargo or serious consequences for the Israeli regime to compel a ceasefire, she would have gained a potentially significant number of votes in these states. And that is the counterfactual that we have to rely on, in addition to the actual vote numbers for a variety of candidates that were explicitly pro-Palestine. And because at the end of the day, the way this affects the movement is that voters who were strongly pro-Palestine and viewed this as part of their election decision were split in the end about how they voted. You know, just to say a little bit more on the polling, there was a poll of strongly pro-Palestine voters that showed over 60% were much more likely to vote for Harris if she ensured a total and unconditional ceasefire, backed an arms embargo, or even simply condemned Israel's genocide of the Palestinians. And many campaigns tried to escalate this demand right up until Election Day with pledges to condition votes on these particular issues. When voters came to the ballot box, certainly some pro-Palestine voters ended up voting for Harris. Many sat out the election, and some voted third party. And while third party votes across every state, and particularly in swing states, were overall not enough to sway the election, not all of them were pro-Palestine votes explicitly for candidates like Cornel West or Jill Stein. In Michigan and Wisconsin, two major states that had these uninstructed votes in the primaries, third-party votes did make up the margin of victory. Trump won Michigan by 80,000, and the third-party votes upwards of 87,000. Wisconsin, there were some roughly 17,000 pro-Palestine third-party votes and 50,000 in total, and the margin Trump won by in Wisconsin there was 30,000. So where does it leave us? Well, you know, as I said, we have a splintered coalition in some ways when it comes to both electoral engagement and what it means to stand up for Palestine when it comes to electoral issues in the United States. And we have a strong case, though, for, you know, what votes could have been gained if Democrats and others across the establishment had embraced a policy that was supported by a majority of their base. And we also have this sort of whiplash effect of civic disengagement from seeing that, it does not matter that a majority of voters or a majority of your base stands strongly in support of a ceasefire or an arms embargo, even in key states, and that an election might be threatened over this issue. No action, none of that matters at the end of the day in the face of the strong support for the Israeli regime and other factors that are playing a role in this election. I think that that's what we'll see continuing as a sort of democratic, weakening across the system under the Trump administration. And I think many people are in the organizing space trying to understand what it looks like to continue to mobilize and mobilize in a much more urgent way when much of the organizing to date has been strong but disappointingly insufficient to change the status quo of what's happening in Gaza and in Lebanon and now Syria when it comes to stopping the Israeli regime.
Thanks, Halah. Andrew, before I get to you on your thoughts on kind of that same question about where we see the movement, Halah, I want to stick with you because you make an interesting point in terms of, the areas in which polling shows that Harris could have at least made a lot of gains in specific swing states if she had at least, distinguished or differentiated herself from the previous administration and come forth with some concrete, policy, promises or goals. Do you? I'm not sure like if you'd be able to answer this, but like, do you know if the Democratic establishment is taking away anything from that? Like, have they kind of like learned that lesson and or are they, reading into their loss entirely different takeaways?
I think that there are different perceptions about this issue. And frankly, there is sort of an ideological obstinacy on the part of many in the Democratic establishment from admitting that the role that this issue has played. But I think, I was working on a number of electoral campaigns, advising a number of electoral campaigns that tried to center Palestine in this election and saw the ways in which the Harris campaign and Democratic Party operatives, did directly engage with certain communities, to take in the material from, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, which ran a poll from, several other grassroots groups that were running polls, and tried to surface that within the Democratic machine in order to show that this was a key issue and to make sure that part of the retrospective is that we can't continue to leave behind this part of the historically Democratic base. I will say, a lot of people have pointed out the Biden campaign originally won against Trump by mobilizing young and progressive and, people of color voters across particularly swing states. And not only did the Harris campaign fare more poorly among those groups, but also did not manage to mobilize the same number of voters to come out. You had over 16 million fewer voters turn out when the Biden win against Trump in 2020 relied on greater voter turnout. So I think there is a reckoning happening, and the data speaks for itself. But I do think it's important for folks within the movement, folks who acted so strongly to center Palestine in an electoral campaign, to point out the ways in which Palestine actually, we did manage to keep Gaza in the news while northern Gaza in particular is being obliterated and starved and under unrelenting attacks that were greater than even October of last year when the genocide began. And so being able to center that, being able to point to this polling and as well as the vote numbers and say there is a huge counterfactual here of what would have been gained if folks had shifted on this issue, that leaves the groundwork for us to have stronger engagement in the future and only continue to build that kind of power.
Thanks, Hannah. So with that, when you say laying the groundwork for this kind of like future of this, movement, Andrew, could you give us your perspective, I guess, on what that movement actually looks like and should be bracing for in the lead up to now the second Trump administration?
Sure. And if you'll permit me just to add a little bit to what Halah was saying, um, I think I think that there is also the reality that coming into this election, um, we are seeing a shift among the American public with regards to Palestine in general. I think we're seeing an improvement in awareness, sympathies shifting. A lot of polling shows that sympathy is shifting. And I think that actually crosses both the left and the right, right? So, like, both, however you want to frame it, liberals and conservatives, whatever framing, like, politically, it is covering the spectrum of political view. However, as I think a lot of us realize, like, it's not translating into the politics. And a good example of that is that coming into this election, while there was debate in the Democratic Party around these policies, while there was opposition to the support for this genocide in the Democratic Party among some candidates, right, and some politicians, elected officials, there really was not much on the Republican side, right? That was very evident. There was very little opposition to these policies, very strong support, generally almost unanimous for the sending of weapons, sometimes calls for expanded support, right? And criticism from the right of Biden for not doing enough, which, as everyone here probably knows, what he is doing is obscene, and what has transpired over the last year has been devastating. Most notably, I mean, we are paying the price for these political shifts in the US, or this rise in awareness, with our people's blood. I mean, we are really, this is what we are witnessing is horrific. I say that just to say that there is a partisan reality in terms of elected officials when it comes to this issue, but I also think that people on the right or conservatives are shifting as well, and you can hear it in some of the discourse. I won't go into the specifics, but I just want to note that. I think that the I think that I hope also that out of this, sort of liberals and progressives evaluate the way that they've treated this genocide with regards to the election and the type of pressure. There was often pressure down towards activists to sort of pipe down in terms of criticisms of the candidates, both Biden and later Harris, when in fact I wonder if that criticism could have instead been leveraged at the campaigns, and that pressure could have been placed on them to make decisions that were, in fact, in my belief and in the outcome of the election seems evident, would have been to their benefit. And I think oftentimes when the polling happens around these issues, there's this idea that, like, Arab and Muslim voters, right, is the category that would be sympathetic or wants to see a shift on policy. And then by contrast, it's pro-Israel Jewish voters, right? That's the framing that happens, which I don't think is accurate. I think it creates a Jewish monolith that doesn't exist. And then I also think it reduces the fact that the general American public actually is shifting on this issue, and that many more voters than just Arabs and Muslims care about these issues and the funding of this genocide. Thinking about the things we can expect in a second Trump administration, the impact movement-wise, I would say we, in the first Trump administration, saw definitely a callousness towards Palestinian life, right? Folks may remember that during the Great March of Return, the Trump administration was in the process of moving the embassy to the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. We had a single day death count in the dozens, where the Israelis had killed dozens of Palestinians in Gaza, and the Trump administration moved forward with its ribbon cutting for the embassy in Jerusalem. Ivanka and Jared Kushner were there cutting the ribbon, celebrating, and there was like very little media coverage, but a few contrasting these two things happening in Jerusalem and Gaza. And I think that really reflects the way that they view Palestinians and the issue of Palestine. I think the Abraham Accords made it really evident that they had very sort of little interest in terms of resolving the issue of Palestinian rights, right? And actually, there was a sort of almost business motivated normalization of relations that was being pushed. Anyway, I think that ultimately, with regards to the administration, the rhetoric we've heard, which kind of reflects some of what happened during the Black uprisings that were happening in the first Trump administration, the rhetoric we've heard is about, crushing the protest that's happening on the streets. Law and order discourse was very strong. You all remember the battle in Portland. I forgot what they dubbed it, but it was the Antifa versus Proud Boys kind of battle. Or I think it was Proud Boys. I don't think it was the Boogaloo Boys. But, the Trump administration and many elected officials, in the administration and some Republican, came out basically saying, yeah, this is great. Like the Antifa are out of line, blah, blah, blah. This was the discourse. And I think that that's going to get much worse with the rhetoric that we've heard this time around leading up to the election. For me, I guess I wonder, we already had a lot of things that people were not paying attention to, I think, were things like the appointment of Kenneth Marcus to the Department of Education, right? For folks who don't know, Kenneth Marcus founded the Brandeis, I think he was leading the Brandeis Law Center, or the Brandeis Center, which took legal action against universities using federal laws to try to kind of the discourse we've seen in this administration, where there has been a targeting of higher ed institutions on the basis of discrimination against Zionism as a political ideology, right? But using the sort of IHRA definition to conflate Zionism, anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. I think we are going to likely see the expansion of that in this administration, which will have a chilling effect on campus activism. You can see it in the discourse that's already happening on the Education and Workforce Committee in Congress, which is was bringing university officials for questioning. So I do think on one hand, there's going to be some chilling actions taken around activism. I don't think that should stop us. I don't think that should stop the brilliant folks who have been mobilizing and been in the streets. But I think it's important to be prepared for that and think about that. I think the stage is being set in so many ways. The Israelis have appointed an ambassador to the US who used to be part of the Jewish Defense League, which was considered a domestic terrorist organization by the FBI and the US government. And him having been appointed, which for folks who don't know, I think it was during the first Trump administration, a Palestinian professor was beaten here in DC while he was participating in protests by members of the Jewish Defense League. They were holding Jewish Defense League flags. And so I think that kind of environment and intimidation is likely to return. And that's something that we should prepare for. But I think that the actual climate in terms of the issue of Palestine and activism has shifted quite a bit. And I say that, I'm sure folks on this call have seen families coming out to protest. I'm sure folks have seen the different ceasefire coalitions that are made up of, folks who have previously or historically not been engaged. And so my hope is that kind of across the board popular sentiment critical of Israel's policies will have an impact and may have some leverage against an administration that has just appointed, for example, a dispensationalist, somebody who is a Christian evangelical who believes in this idea of, all Jews returning to Israel so that they can meet their fate and the end of the world, this apocalyptic vision can happen. That to me is, it's concerning, and it signals something very challenging for the future of trying to put pressure and leverage against this future administration, meaning the Trump 2 administration. I'll stop there.
I think that's a good point. I kind of want to stick with you on that one point, though, because I would definitely argue that, the fundamentals of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is a relationship that's very much based on unconditional support for Israel, absolute Israeli impunity, et cetera, that remains constant, regardless of who's sitting in the White House. But I think, as you pointed out, the Trump's, uniquely tight embrace of Israel has particularly dangerous consequences. And we saw those consequences in his first term. But do you think that, you know, Trump's more transparent and unapologetic embrace of Israel, especially right now in the midst of genocide, do you think that's gonna elicit a more widespread reaction from Americans across the, you know, political spectrum who perhaps were hesitant to speak out against Biden, or who were hesitant to kind of like break with party ranks? Do you think that is going to fundamentally shift so that we can kind of like move, so that the Palestinian solidarity movement kind of expands from you know, the progressive Arab American, Palestinian American, Muslim American circles that have represented its core up to this point, to a more kind of like wider, potentially even more mainstream movement?
A good question. So I think that first, definitely during the Trump 1 administration, we saw that a significant shift among liberals becoming more sympathetic around the issue of Palestine. And it's clear that that was it was a reaction to the Trump administration and the type of embrace and the rhetoric it was using, right? Which was sort of openly, I don't maybe call it not just openly racist, kind of openly colonialist language, right? Very, very brazen remarks, very clearly indicating that they did not value Palestinian life, we'll say. I think that, you know, but and also there were some of the like attempts to bring certain Palestinian businessmen in order to like work with them. So I do think that that shift will continue happening. I also think this coincides with the fact that the pro-Israel lobby in the United States has already become more and more transparent itself, right? It has become emboldened. It has become more open. AIPAC is tweeting and celebrating different election victories. So I do think we're in a different moment in which the openness and transparency of the Israel lobby in terms of what it's doing and the language and discourse that Trump is using will align to create more of a reaction. I also have, and I say more of a reaction among people who are less politicized around this issue, who are becoming familiar with this issue, who are realizing something is really wrong. Will that happen quickly enough to stop, for example, the continued annexation and colonization of our lands? I don't know. Will that be a force considering the kind of cult-like following that Trump seems to have among many supporters? I don't know. And I think those are variables that have proven to be challenging in the past. Like those are things that we have seen people. I mean, a good example is in the discourse running up to the discourse around this election and the rhetoric running up to it. How many people sort of, and I think Chris Hayes says something like, Trump says something for everyone, right? So that everyone has something they can pretend to believe in, but we all know he's lying in each of these settings. And I think that a good example of that is, you know, his rhetoric around we're going to bring peace to the Middle East, right? You saw voters who embraced that, many of them Arab and Muslim voters in Michigan, say like, oh yeah, that's, you know, he's saying that he's going to bring peace and I believe he could do it. And look at what Biden is doing. Biden is facilitating a genocide. So therefore Trump, you know, probably will be better. And there's nothing to sort of substantiate that, right? There's nothing about the language he used that is in any way something that we can hold him to account for. And on the contrary, his first ambassador in his first period as president, his first presidency, his ambassador was somebody who openly supported Israeli settlements, right? I think he even like donated to Israeli settlement organizations. And now in the second presidency, he's nominated somebody who not only openly supports settlements, but actually embraces this very apocalyptic vision of what should happen in Palestine, which is essentially like a death march in terms of what will happen to the Palestinians. So I do think while I will not jump to any conclusions in terms of what will happen, right? We don't know. There are so many variables. And I don't want to say that anything can be worse than a genocide, quite honestly. I mean, this is the worst thing we have witnessed since 1948 in Palestine, and I think so many of our families are impacted in such disturbing ways. I do think that this is a very visible thing that we are witnessing. It's visceral, causes a visceral reaction. The Trump administration could make this go away and then continue annexing land until everybody is displaced slowly, piece by piece. And their policies have historically embraced that. And so I don't doubt that that could continue happening. Again, the embassy in Jerusalem has never moved back, right? It's still there. I mean, the Biden administration kept it there as well. So I also want to flag for people that the advancements that the Trump administration has made historically in its first presidency, didn't get really shifted back, right? The recognition of the Golan Heights as part of Israel, that didn't get reversed by the Biden administration, right? I never heard a statement renouncing that. So those policies also have long-term impacts that I feel like just kind of, maybe in this community went noticed, but by and large went unnoticed, right? When I tell people that the Golan Heights is occupied, I don't know how much people are paying attention to the Golan Heights until recently, of course, this last week.
Thanks, Andrew. Halah, I wanted to kind of jump back to you because, maybe like while there might be, like Andrew said, this, more of a widespread collective movement abroad and especially in the US, it is going to come up against, again, a Trump crackdown that we're going to see by Trump himself in the executive and enabled by Republican control of the House and the Senate. So in October, for example, the Conservative Heritage Foundation, which is the same think tank that released Project 25, which was that conservative blueprint for Trump's return to power, also published Project Esther, which is essentially a campaign that aims to destroy Palestinian solidarity movement by targeting organizations and nonprofit organizations in the US with lawfare, targeting their funding sources, sowing internal discord. So I guess what do these initiatives mean for the movement here in the US, and what is being done to kind of push back against that or prepare for that onslaught?
Halah, you're muted.
Oh, am I good now? Okay. Some of these initiatives, right now, Project Esther in particular may be seen as sort of harebrained. They lack legitimacy. Even just reading through Project Esther, it's very, it's hard to take it seriously in some ways. But the reality is that the institutions like the Heritage Foundation that produce such reports will be taken seriously and materially supported, and their policies materially supported under a Trump administration. And that's very dangerous. The initiative that you mentioned tries to criminalize and vilify groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as American Muslims for Palestine, and a whole range of organizations that are really homes and longtime homes that have been building support for the pro-Palestine movement in the United States, and really making sure that the conversation about the Israeli regime represents as broad a base of a progressive movement as possible. But I think it's important to also recognize the ways that this administration and Democrats in particular have contributed and laid the groundwork for, this type of crackdown on Palestine and pro-Palestine organizing, starting with allowing for the crackdown on students with these sort of McCarthyite sort of congressional hearings with university presidents, supporting and largely the legislation that criminalizes Palestinian nonprofits had support from Democrats, many Democrats in the House and Senate, even though it didn't pass this time around. Criminalizing critique of the Israeli regime as anti-Semitism, opposing historic federal cases to hold, the Biden administration, Blinken, and other officials accountable for human rights violations, and trying to hold U.S. aid accountable to its own laws with the Foreign Assistance Act. All of these sort of log jams being placed in the way of the existing justice system, opposing and moving against the ICJ decision and its jurisdiction within the United States, meeting with Yoav Gallant and Netanyahu after their arrest warrants had been issued, and saying that they won't uphold that Court of International Law, calling student encampments chaos, and allowing for crackdowns and mass police brutality against students. This all happened under Democratic administration. And UNRWA funding was dismantled under false allegations that came from the Israeli regime and were completely unsubstantiated. This laid the groundwork for the dismantling of pro-Palestine organizing that the Trump administration will only try to continue. And I think it's really dangerous not to call out the ways in which this effort has been a bipartisan one, and the ways that this crackdown on pro-Palestine organizing becomes a template for crackdowns on all other types of movement organizing. The arbitrary and arrest and search of activists' home has happened to Palestinian activists in Pennsylvania, as well as activists against Cop City in Atlanta. And this is something that, if it's ignored, on Palestine, it will only come to the backyards of other communities. And I think that's what we have to really pay attention to.
No, I think that's a really important point, because you're right. I mean, the crackdown on Palestinian speech and activism in the U.S. is very much bipartisan. It's been going on for years, if not decades already. And I think it's like, yes, of course, it's that crackdown is going to intensify, absolutely, as the incoming administration has promised. But I think to understand it, we also have to, like you say, recognize that it is very much bipartisan. But with that in mind, I that kind of has got me thinking about a different question that kind of requires us to step back and look at the U.S. like from afar, right? I think that the reason we're having this conversation to begin with is because we assume that U.S. policy towards Israel needs to change, right? For there to be a change in Israeli policy towards the Palestinians, right? But what I'm wondering is, we've seen public opinion in the U.S. slowly shift, and sure, there's a lot more work to do in that realm, right? But it's even the substantial changes that we have seen have had little to no impact on U.S. policy. In fact, Washington seems to have only doubled down on its unconditional support for Israel over the past year. So I guess my question now is, what are the realistic limits of the U.S. role in pressuring Israel to fundamentally change? And I guess the question is, can the U.S. ever shed its title as "quote unquote" Israel's lawyer, right? What are your thoughts on that? Halah, maybe we could start with you and then finish with Andrew.
Well, I think this is something that will continue to be debated for a long while, and again under this coming administration. But I think what it emphasizes, and what all of the precedent of the electoral legacy of the way that Palestine was centered in this election represents, is the importance of focusing in particular more and more on economic consequences for the Israeli regime, and for the United States support for the Israeli regime. And this has borne out in several recent victories. I think, we know the BDS movement is a serious threat to, Israel's continued policy of apartheid and, war crimes and other forms of oppression. And the boycott efforts have grown massively. Now, some of the more focused boycott efforts have move to the sidelines. But I think there's an interest and an importance in bringing those back to the center and focusing on industries and worker-led movements against industries where Americans are made directly complicit in the Israeli regime's violence. That's focused on weapons companies, shipping companies, and many industries, banking industries that are directly involved in financing and enabling the Israeli regime. And I think that emphasis on economic consequences will be also more important to an administration that is, by the wealthy for the wealthy, which the Trump administration is. And so I think drawing the connections as much as we can between U.S. spending on a variety of war crimes in the Middle East on many countries, and the degradation in social safety nets that we will see under the Trump administration for Americans here at home, that drawing those connections will be particularly important as well, to drive home the economic cost of maintaining a genocide and maintaining an apartheid regime.
Thanks, Halah. Andrew, do you have any thoughts you wanted to add to that as well?
Sure, yeah. I mean, on the continuity of the sort of policy through Democratic and Republican presidencies and administrations, I definitely think we saw this in the early 2000s, right? And actually the rhetoric is quite similar currently, sort of war on terror rhetoric that was established in the early 2000s that we've now heard the Trump administration and some of his officials that are nominated and Congress members saying some of this, using the term terror a lot, as I think does Project Esther, to say essentially like these are terror groups on our streets, right? There was an attempt to portray the encampments as Iranian backed, which is very silly. But all of this rhetoric actually really is reminiscent of the early 2000s, and notably many of the policies that were passed, like the Patriot Act, came from foundationally policies that the Clinton administration passed before George W. Bush was elected, or won the election somehow. The 2000s, I guess, that led to the attacks on a number of nonprofits, right? We all know the Holy Land Foundation, for example, being targeted for actually donating essentially to the same organizations or institutions that USAID was donating to at the same time. And many of those folks are still in prison. I think one of them was very recently released, but I think several of the board members are still there. I think that's the type of thing that we're looking at again, but I don't think that the environment is ripe for being able to execute it the same way. And so my hope is that we are in a moment where sympathies have shifted so much that it will be much harder for something like that to be carried out. And I think that there's much more disillusionment about these kinds of labels and this use of language, as well as the weaponization of anti-Semitism for pro-Palestinian discourse, right, or pro-Palestinian rhetoric. So I'm hopeful on that front. I also think that I think historically I thought of us as needing to shift U.S. policy and shift U.S. sentiments among politicians. And Halah brought up the BDS movement. I think that that's extremely critical to creating material impacts and actually changing the economic circumstances that are supporting this and the political will to support what is happening. I also think we've reached a moment where I maybe did not foresee this historically, but I think we've reached a moment where the US is slowly becoming less central to decision-making around the world, like internationally, with regards to Palestinians and Israel. And I say that to say, I think the United States intervened quite a bit to prevent countries from taking actions historically. But in the last year, for example, we have seen so many countries end their diplomatic relations. We've seen European countries historically that would be lockstep with the United States start to shift on their policies. Obviously, Germany, quite an outlier, but Spain, for example, right? And my hope is that means that two things will happen. We will have waning influence in terms of opposition to Israel's policies and its actions. And at the same time, I think we as folks living in the United States have a responsibility to continue to pressure for a shift in policy. I do think that Palestine will become a central issue as folks take up a struggle against what seems like it is going to be a rather authoritarian regime that is going to come in now, in terms of the rhetoric that's been said and the, Trump's declaration that he'll be a dictator on day one. And my hope is that that will mean that more of these liberals and progressives who just watched the impact of Gaza on this election will understand the significance of standing up and speaking out around these things, and the centrality of it in terms of opposing this right-wing rise that has been happening across the United States and truly across a lot of countries.
I will also say, if I may, Tariq, that I think it's really important that we, and this came up with the election as well, with such split strategies across how to, advocate for Palestine at the ballot box on November 5th. We can't afford, as a pro-Palestine movement, to lead with cynicism. And I think much as the picture is very grim and has been very grim, it has been very grim in the past as well. And we've made huge strides, as Andrew said, in public support, both within the wider populace, but also within circle, people in power. You asked me before whether, the Democratic administration conversations have shifted to understand the role that Palestine played in the election. And I think, not to, throw around names that we hear so often and are just singular examples, but, Senator Sanders' move to and comments on the election afterwards really substantiated the way in which this was a massive abandonment of a progressive issue, including on Palestine, progressive base. And we also saw 19 senators support a joint resolution of disapproval for continued weapons to the Israeli regime amid the genocide. And I think that, that we should not rely on these systems to deliver, justice for us, but we must hold them accountable, and we must continue pushing in all of the ways that we can. And we can't afford to leave, any mechanism or any tool on the table when our people are being annihilated. And I say this as a Palestinian, and I say this as somebody who wants to see all people's rights protected in what is going to be a very difficult 4 years for many, many communities.
Thanks for that, Halah. I actually kind of want to stick with you on one more thing, because there was a comment, or I guess a question in the chat that I think is important because it touches on the political cost of expressing support for Palestinians and the actual political cost of changing the US policy towards Israel, right? And because I think in previous elections and in future elections, politicians and candidates will be making their decisions based on, sure, the pro-Palestine movement has garnered more support and is something that we need to consider, but the political costs of doing anything other than the status quo are going to continue to be immense. And so the question is, how many votes would Harris have lost if she had promised a ceasefire in order to get pro-Palestinian voices? And my understanding is that the data showed that more undecided voters were more willing to vote for her, specifically if she had changed that position. But could you tell us more about that, and I guess wider about yes, public opinion is shifting, but those costs for actually shifting policy from the pro-Israel lobby and Israel apologists in the US remain high, if not higher than ever now, as they're cracking down on our movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers suggest the numbers are a little bit of a complicated story. In Michigan and Wisconsin, third-party votes exceeded the margin of victory, but not all of those third-party votes were for explicitly pro-Palestine candidates. So what else are we looking at? We're talking about the voters who did not show up on Election Day, the over 16 million voters who didn't show up on Election Day. Who were those what were those voters primarily upset about, or so demobilized and demotivated by? And I think that it's definitely a mixed picture. Most folks within the polling space would point out data that suggests that economic issues, the increased cost of living, inflation, these were top issues, and folks didn't feel that they had real options on the table to be motivated by at the ballot box. But I would also argue that many progressive and leftist voters, folks who should have been in Harris's corner, were alienated by her appeals to right-wing leaders like Dick Cheney, bringing former Trump officials to the Democratic National Convention and having them be spokespeople for the Democratic Party to say, "Hey, I know you may be a conservative, and so am I, but we shouldn't support Trump. We should support Harris because she's closer to the right. She's closer to us than she is to the radical left." And I think this sort of indicates the way in which a certain segment of people was explicitly left out of this election, and that makes up the counterfactual. And by counterfactual, I mean what would have happened if Harris had supported an arms embargo or had shifted her language significantly to condemn the genocide. And I think what we see is that, I'm sorry if there may be a little bit of background noise, but I think what we see is that, polling from the IMEU, polling from YouGov and Underpin right before the election suggests that in swing states, over 60% of these voters strongly supported a ceasefire and would have been much more likely to vote for Harris if she supported a ceasefire, an arms embargo, or stood with stronger language on any of these issues. But instead, she alienated this part of her base, and I think that's why we have such a clear case to be made about why, yes, people will be held accountable, public officials will be held accountable, especially by moneyed interests, if they stand against the pro-Israel lobby. But at the same time, the voter base is shifting such that this is becoming an issue where I may not be motivated to vote for a particular candidate because of a range of US-based issues, including higher costs of living. But the tipping point is that I also see you as somebody who unabashedly supports genocide and will continue to send US dollars abroad to violence that I definitely don't support, and meanwhile not support my family here at home. So making that connection, I think, will have consequences across the board. And that being said, too, I think as many communities face crackdowns under the Trump administration, immigrant communities under attack, LGBTQ communities under attack, women's rights under attack, voters' rights in general under attack, there will be a rise in conversations about the role of white supremacy in the Trump administration. And I think it'll be more important than ever to draw the connections between these white supremacist movements and Christian Zionism, which is something that, of course, I've written about for Al-Shabaka in particular, but this alignment is why we see such expanded warfare in an Armageddonist vision of the end of the world. And we see with Mike Huckabee, a Christian Zionist, as Trump's U.S. ambassador to Israel, that is substantiated even more as part of the thinking and motivations that we need to be very explicit in calling out, so that we can draw the connection to the white supremacist attacks across the board that we will be seeing under the Trump administration, both domestically and abroad.
Thanks, Halah. So we only have like 4 or 5 more minutes, but there is a question specifically about what we expect the changes on the ground for Palestinians to see with the Trump administration, specifically in regards to, concrete issues like settlements, humanitarian support, economic aid, spending / a resurrected quote unquote two-state solution peace process. Maybe I could, get both of your takes on that, just in a couple minutes that we have. Obviously, it's very hard to it's, he's a very unpredictable, leader and so on and so forth. But yeah, if you could, maybe Andrew could start with you and then finish with Halah.
Sure. I mean, I think as a starting point, some of the movement we've seen, right? I mentioned the newly appointed Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Over the last year, we've seen that there has been a significant New York publication did a piece on um, the increase in funding to Israeli settlement NGOs in the United States that included NGOs that are now actually arming. They're providing like equipment, military gear to Israeli settlers. Right? We saw the Minister of Interior, the Israeli Minister of Interior Ben Gvir, kind of just handing out, or Minister of National Security handing out weapons, right, personally to Israeli settlers. I think that the thing that's obviously happening is a lot of moves are being made to begin to annex more of the West Bank, right? And we hear the rhetoric, but the rhetoric is less important than the reality of what you actually see happening. You see town by town Israeli settlers in coordination with Israeli soldiers making moves on different villages. So I think that for starters, we are looking at something more significant and cohesive happening in the coming year as a policy shift. And I imagine that we're going to see. I mean, the first Trump presidency included an ambassador who believed that, quote unquote, Judea and Samaria are part of the greater Israel. And I think we're going to see some sort of materializations of that as policy. And I also think that the sort of fantasies of the Israelis with regard to Gaza, and particularly like thinking about what's happening in northern Gaza, are likely to be more permissible under this Trump presidency. That's not to say that they're not already under this Biden presidency, but I think it will be a continuation or potentially like more of a free hand in that regard. But I also think we're going to see a shift in uh, a, a Palestinian response and a more coherent Palestinian response as we see these escalations, like we just saw with the Palestinian Authority attacking fighters in the Jenin camp. And also as we see Israelis passing laws that further alienate Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? Who number somewhere close to 2 million, are 20% of the Israeli citizenry. And like they just passed a law very recently, essentially saying that they can deport, whatever that means, these Israeli citizens. So I imagine, or I'm hopeful that out of this arises a more coherent Palestinian and cohesive Palestinian strategy for the coming year, and a more united front in trying to challenge what's happening on the ground. We have a pretty robust and rich sort of civil society, and I'm hoping that that will contribute internally the way that it has actually contributed quite a bit to a global call for a boycott, for example.
Thanks, Andrew. Halah, any final words? I mean, we're over time, but we'd love to have you close us out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's true overall that the facts on the ground have been shifting and will shift. And, what annexation means for Palestinians overall will be, I think, a mixed picture. Obviously, annexation and land theft is part of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. But at the same time, I think there is a resilience to the Palestinian spirit and resistance to our occupation. And that means that, in many ways, the ways that, Palestine has been divided up in many different subsections has been part of the ways in which Palestinian resistance to occupation and all forms of resistance have been split. And I think that might also be shifting if, folks are more under a singular apartheid authority. So that's something to look out for. But I think across the board, we have a lot of work to do, but we also have many more allies and much more awareness to build it upon.
Thanks, Halah. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you both. I wish we could stay on and talk for longer, but we are out of time. But before we sign off, I do want to remind everyone that These labs are crowdfunded, so we'd be really thankful for any contributions you can make. And if you are able to donate, there should be a donate button that should appear somewhere on your screen. But thank you again for joining. Please stay tuned for our next Policy Lab next month, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks.